Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today I'm joined by Sally Bibb and she'll be discussing around discovering your strengths and thrive. So throughout this webinar, Sally's got some poll questions, so they'll pop up on your screen when we get to those. So hopefully you can answer them, and obviously we'll mention the results throughout the webinar. At the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, please put them inside the question tab, and obviously we'll get a chance to answer them all at the end. Sally has agreed that any unanswered questions she'll get in touch with you following the webinar. So please don't worry, we'll get through all the questions. There will be a question which will be put into the chat. So obviously we'd love to hear where you're dialing in from today, and obviously it sort of builds more of an experience for the webinar. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Sally.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to everybody from joining from wherever you are in the world. I'm in the Greek island of Sifnos. It's a nice sunny afternoon here, and it's a pleasure to be invited by the Association of MBAs to do this. So welcome to the wonderful and transformational world of strengths. I've got a number of areas I want to talk to you about today, and I want to make it as interactive as we possibly can, given that it's a webinar. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the theory and some of the evidence base behind strengths, what strengths are, and so on. And then going to give you an opportunity to start to think about your own strengths. And then for those of you that work in organisations or that maybe you're a manager, I'm going to give a little bit of a talk about that aspect of strengths and how strengths can make an organisation more successful. Before we get started on that, though, I would like to tell you a short story. Let me take you back to about a year ago, before lockdown. I was doing what I'm sure lots of people did in those days. I was sitting in a cafe between meetings, checking my emails. I was concentrating hard, sitting at my computer, typing away. Suddenly, I became aware of somebody watching me. There's a guy standing at the counter looking over at me. I looked up, didn't recognize him, carried on with what I was doing, but I was aware that he was still looking at me. A couple of minutes later, he came over my table to my table, pulled up a chair, sat down right opposite, and in almost a challenging way, leant in and said, "Hello, Sally." And I had no idea who he was. He did it again. "Hello, Sally." So I said, "I'm really sorry, but I don't recognize you." And he said his name. And I realized that here was a guy who, a couple of decades ago, I'd made his life misery. This chap was one of the people that I managed when I was promoted into my first job as manager. And my boss said to me, "There's an issue with this guy, you need to performance manage him," which really in those days, and possibly still now in some cases, meant kind of nitpicking every day on what he was doing wrong. And it was awful because I didn't feel as though I knew what I was doing. I had an HR process to follow, but every day that this guy was doing a lot of things wrong. And it was awful for him. It was really awful for me. I felt out of my depth. I didn't feel like the supportive manager I wanted to be. And the bottom line was that I now realise was that he was in the wrong job. And so I was effectively trying to make him into something he wasn't. And the company was inadvertently trying to do that, which, you know, some companies still do it today. So I was glad this chap came up to me at the cafe, and I looked him in the eye and I said, "I want to apologise for how I treated you those years ago. I didn't realise what was going on. I didn't realise that, you know, effectively you were in the wrong job, and I was trying to get you to fix all of these weaknesses." And I told him that nowadays my work is dedicated to helping individuals and organisations to make sure that they're in a job that suits them, where they're a round peg in a round hole instead of a square peg in a round hole like this chap was. So that is the essence of what we're talking about when we're talking about strengths. We are talking about allowing people to really be who they are and thrive with who they are. Challenge is, not many of us, even as we get older, really understand deeply who we are, because we tend to take ourselves for granted. So hopefully with this webinar, you'll have more of an understanding of that for yourself. So let us get going, she says, trying to move the first slide. Okay, so this little boy, I wonder if you can guess who he is. One of the things about strengths and our motivations and our values is you can see them quite early on in children. Here's what was said about him when he was young. David's quietly confident, he's greatly interested in animals and rocks, he enjoys learning and expressing his views, he's adventurous, he loves to have goals, and he takes the initiative. Have a think about who you think this world famous person might be. I'm sure quite a few of you have guessed already. Yeah, David Attenborough. Let me give you another one. This little girl, she loves to be in the countryside and has a fascination with hills and clouds. She enjoys drawing and playing the piano. She collects rocks and shells. She's very diligent and patient. Bit of a hard one, this one, but maybe some of you have guessed who she is. Barbara Hepworth, the famous sculptor. So these two individuals were lucky enough to find their path, to really understand what brought them alive, what they loved doing, what energized them early on in life. And that's really a central challenge of our lives, is to find satisfying and meaningful work. You know, to understand what our passions are, to be to be doing things that are in line with who we are as a person. And the thing to remember is that what feels meaningful and deeply satisfying for one person is different from what another person will find meaningful and satisfying. So it's about really understanding ourselves, and for organisations to bring the best out of their people, and for managers to bring the best out of our people, it's really trying to tap into that. And when you've got an organisation like that, of course, it's very vibrant because people are in their own zone doing what they love. I'm going to take a step back now and explain to you what it is I'm talking about and what I mean by strength. I'm going to give you a definition of a strength. So a strength is something that somebody loves doing, and I use the word love deliberately. It's not what you quite like doing, it's what you love doing, what you can't wait to get to your desk and get started with. What the things that stay on the top of that go on the top of your to-do list and get crossed off first. They're the things that once you've done them, you want to go back and do them all over again. So you're also very good at those things. And the crucial bit is these are the things, our strengths are the things that energize us. And our strengths include our deeper motivations and our values. So for example, great nurses, they love to make a difference. That's a motivation, it's a value, and it's something that is one of their strengths. And people who play to their strengths, there's a lot of evidence now after at least a couple of decades of an evidence growing academic and practical evidence base from employers all over the world. So we now know that people who play to their strengths are more productive and successful. They tend to be more satisfied with their life and work, and they have the greatest growth potential because when they know their strengths, they can consciously use them to do more satisfying things, to bring more joy into their lives. So let me ask you, and we're going to go to our first poll question now, Paul, if we could. How well do you think you know your strengths right now? Very well, you've got some idea, not very well, or not at all.
Okay, so we've got the poll open for everyone. We'll just give it a few more moments for them to answer, and then I'll give you the results. Okay, results are in. So we've had 19% say very well, 55% say I've got some idea. We've had 22% say not very well, and 4% say not at all.
Okay, thanks folks for answering that. So we've got a little bit of opportunity here to give you more of an idea of your strengths in a bit more detail. So let's get going with that. So let's have a look at where strengths come from now. So for those of you who like to know about the sort of the kind of evidence base behind a concept. So the neurobiology now tells us that 42 days before birth, a baby's first neuron is created. 162 days, there's 100 billion neurons. And then the first synapse starts to be connected between the neurons. And then something really weird starts to happen and we start to lose our synaptic connections. So what's happening effectively is the synaptic connections that remain are like the 4-lane, really well-maintained highway. They are the things that create our strengths. The more we use them, the more we like using them, the better we get at them. The things that we're less good at are like the kind of old tracks that aren't very well maintained. So if you, for example, if you're a connector, you'll have been a connector from a very young age, that synapse will start to become more and more developed. And that's something that you'll get better and better at throughout your life. And the thing is, we know that the brain's plastic. We know that the brain can create new synaptic connections throughout lives if somebody has a very serious accident, for example. But it's really, really hard to do that. It's really, really hard to relearn that. And I know myself, my mum sadly had a stroke earlier this year. She's doing really well now, but she lost her ability to speak. And the doctors and the speech therapists explained to us that the part of the brain that was responsible for speech was damaged. It couldn't work anymore. So she had to teach another part of the brain how to speak. And it was a very arduous process. It's still an ongoing process. So that's the mechanism through which our strengths are developed. And you can often see it very, very early on in young children. I've got a friend, her little boy, from being a toddler, started to organise their shoes. It was quite an untidy household, and he would organise the shoes in the downstairs cupboard all the time. He loves organisation and he loves to create order. And that was really clear early on. So if you've got children or you know children, it's worth sort of noticing what kind of things they're drawn to. What do they sort of do habitually from quite a young age? And the thing is about strengths is that it challenges the sometimes unspoken assumptions that we have grown up with and that organisations work with often, which is that we can all be all-rounders, we can all learn to tick the boxes to be good at a certain list of competencies, and that we don't really have enough strengths and we need to be different to be better. No, forget all that. What this tells us and what the growing body of evidence tells us is that we are who we are from a young age, from our late teens, and the real opportunity in life is to become more of who you are. Football managers understand this, right? Football managers understand that to understand the players in their team and get to the in-depth grips of what this person's strengths are and then putting those strengths together in the team, that's where the opportunities lie, not to try and make a good goalkeeper into a good defender. And the other thing is that it's about progression means climbing the ladder. How many times have you heard about managers, or maybe you've been one, managers who've been promoted because they've been great at their job? They get promoted to be a manager because there's more status, but they don't love managing people. It's not who they are. And then they become miserable, like my situation. I didn't know about managing, and it was miserable for everybody concerned. And finally, the other assumption that strengths challenges is that fixing weaknesses is the route to high performance. It really isn't. And we are programmed as human beings to fix weaknesses, because from being a caveman and cavewoman, we had to be alert to threats in our environment. So we are programmed to notice what's wrong and try and fix it. But I'm going to come on to talk about weaknesses a little bit later, so we can try and recalibrate and say the biggest opportunity comes from knowing our strengths. And it's not showing off, it's not bragging, it's about service. We can give more service, we can do more in the world if we know our strengths and can tell other people, so there's an opportunity to use them more. I love to show this image. So Michelangelo, the sculptor, talked about how every rock contains a statue, and the job of the sculptor is to unveil that statue. And I remember this image because I think it's such a great one to think about as a manager or as a parent. You know, our job is to try and unveil and reveal the beauty within each person, and it's a good one to remember for if you're interviewing people as well, because we've all got that beauty, we've all got those strengths inside. So we're coming up now to poll question 2. Thinking about the fact that our strengths are the things that energize us. So Paul, let's get the next poll question. How much of your time do you spend doing work that energizes you? Never, less than 20%, or 20% or more?
Excellent. So the poll's open for everyone to answer. Obviously, we will have a Q&A section at the end. If any of the listeners have got any questions throughout the webinar, please type them in. We'll do our best to get through all of them. So we're pretty much there. So I'll close the poll now and give you the results. So we have had 4% say never. We've had 55% say less than 20%, and we have 41% say 20% or more.
Great. Well, the 41%, that's great that you're in that situation. By the end of this webinar, I'm hoping that more of you can feel like you're heading towards that situation. The good news is, I mean, 20% doesn't sound a lot, but research from the Mayo Clinic is suggesting that you only need to play to your strengths 20% of the time to be protected from burnout. And if you think about it, it's common sense. When we're doing the things that we love, that energize us, we feel better, we feel stronger, we feel more resilient. We feel as though we can cope with more. And so if you're playing to your strengths 20% or more of the time, then you've got that protective factor. So let me see if I can help you for those of you that aren't playing to your strengths 20%, let's see if I can help you to become aware of your strengths and find ways of nudging that up a little bit. So for the next little section of this webinar, I'm going to get you hopefully to be in a reflective mode about your own strengths. Have a think. Do you almost always have a list of things to do and stick to it even at weekends? Do you love ticking things off when you've done them? If you're nodding furiously at this question, if this feels like you, then you've probably got a strength in organisation. It's certainly one of my strengths, and I'm the sort of person that if I do something that wasn't on my list, I put it on the list with the satisfaction of crossing it off again. Do you almost always win or come first? Do you like to pick someone to race while you're driving or out on your bike? If that's true of you, you may have competitiveness as a strength, which is a wonderful strength if you're a salesperson. It's a wonderful strength if you're a sports person. So maybe that's resonating for you. Do you almost always talk to people in lifts, queues and planes? Do you love striking up conversations with people you don't know? If that sounds like you, you may well have a strength in connecting. So start to have a think about what are the things that you can't not do wherever you are. Maybe it's something that your friends or loved ones comment on. You know, there they are doing that again. There they are organising people. There they are chatting to people. And there they go again, helping people. It's the things that you can't not do. Think of it that way. And just to help that along, think about one time when you were at your best. It can be a really small situation. It could be helping the person next door. It could be solving a problem at work that other people were struggling with. Bring to mind a time when you were at your best. I'm going to give you a minute or so just to have a think about that. Think about exactly what you were doing and what was that like. And it's a good question to ask other people if you've got children, if you manage people. It's a really good way into people's strengths. Another good way is to ask them, what did you do last week that you felt really great about, that energized you, that gave you a bit of a lift? These are questions that can really help people to connect with the natural them. Because as I say, often people just take themselves for granted and they don't know. So a good way of thinking about our strengths, a structured way of thinking about our strengths and how we might develop our strengths is this. 4 areas. So top left, our realised strengths. So these are the things that might have easily come to mind when I asked you the last question. There might have been things that you started thinking about as soon as you registered for this webinar. So you use them regularly, you're aware of them somewhat, although you may not value them and you may take them for granted. Top right, your unrealised strengths. So these are the things that, with the sort of questions that I'm asking you, you start to understand that there are other things that you bring to bear on the world that are real gifts. Let me give you an example of that. One chap that I worked with, he was absolutely brilliant in meetings when things got a bit tense. He had a really wonderful, natural way of using humour to break the ice. And he was so good at it, but he didn't often do it. And we had a conversation about it one day, and it turns out that when he was a child, he would get told off for showing off if he was funny. So unconsciously, he tried to suppress that part of himself. So for him, realizing that his humor was actually a great strength, and if he could use it consciously and in situations of where it would be really helpful and have a positive impact, that was a really good additional thing that he could bring to improve his performance and also help the lives of others around him. And it's not always that things get suppressed for us as a child, but sometimes we're working in a context where we don't think of using our strengths, or maybe we don't think they're valued by our manager, so we don't fully bring them to bear. That's why it's great to know them and to say to yourself, even on a weekly basis, what am I doing this week, and what can I use? What for my strengths armor can I use? Bottom left, overdone strengths. So these are our strengths where we don't always use them intelligently or wisely. And this area can be a big derailer for executives. For example, if you have a real strength in drive and you overdo it, other people can be left feeling a bit overwhelmed or beaten down by you. Another example, it's one of my strengths, honesty and straightforwardness. If you overdo that strength, it can occasionally come across as a bit blunt and can have not a particularly positive impact on people. So it's really good to know those ones that you might get carried away and you overuse them or you don't use them intelligently so that it can make people go, oh, you know, and it can have an adverse impact. It's not about saying don't be who you are. It's about really understanding how you can have the best possible effect on the world. And also when you start to be able to have this sort of conversation with colleagues or people who work for you, it makes it okay because you're not criticizing them, you're not telling them they're deficient, you're framing everything in the context of how can we all use our strengths for the best advantage of others and to make ourselves feel the most fulfilled that we can. Last but not least, weaknesses. Now, I don't like to use euphemisms. I don't like to use, development opportunities because we're all human and we've all got weaknesses. The real question is, what weaknesses do I have that matter in this current job or this current project that I'm working on? And once you know that, then you can decide, well, how can I mitigate those weaknesses? How can I either use some of my strengths to mitigate them? Do I have a colleague who's brilliant at that thing that I'm not brilliant at, who loves doing it? Maybe you could do a bit of swapping around. If that's not possible, can I sandwich my weaknesses between? So if I've got to do something, so let me give you an example. One of my weaknesses is detail. So if I'm working on a detailed spreadsheet, which I have to do sometimes, I will do something that plays to my strength before it and after it to keep my energy up. But I'll also have a colleague who's brilliant at detail check that spreadsheet before it goes anywhere. So thinking about your weaknesses in that way makes it more helpful, and it means that it's nothing to be ashamed of, and you can talk to colleagues in that way, which is a positive way rather than I should try and hide my weaknesses or try and fix them. And I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of performance appraisals throughout my life when I was working for companies where every year the same things came up. I might have been sent on a training course or had some coaching, but didn't really improve things. It just served to make me feel a bit more downhearted that I couldn't make myself into something that I'm not, basically. So get to know each other's strengths in the team you're working in or the family that you're in as a way of supporting each other and bringing out the best of each other. Let's go to the next poll question. On that note, how well do you know your colleagues' strengths? Pretty well, not very well, or not at all?
So we've got the poll question open for everyone. We'll give it a few more moments for everyone to answer, and then I'll come back on with the results. Okay, the results are 58% pretty well, 39% not very well, and 3% not at all.
That is a very good result, isn't it? It sounds like a lot of people know their colleagues quite well. I'm kind of wondering to myself now whether you've got to know each other better during the pandemic, because it's been, we've all gone into people's homes and maybe opened up more. I don't know. Interesting question. Thank you for that, folks. So let's think about, where do strengths fit in to the whole picture of what we need to do our jobs well? So, as I've said, a strength which includes motivations and values, they are who you are as a person. They are innate patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior. In some jobs, of course, you also need knowledge. If you're a doctor, you need obviously clinical knowledge, and you also need skills and how to, techniques and so on. So with some jobs, of course, you don't. Some jobs you can be recruited just by being the right sort of person, because when you get into the job, you can be taught the knowledge and skills. If you add those things together, coupled with your aspiration, that is what it's the strengths that differentiate superior performers from the rest, because they bring an energy to a job because they're right for the job. Makes sense, which is a good segue into strengths and organizations. So why do organizations switch to strengths? And if I could hear you talking to me right now, I'm sure you would get the answer to these questions. Since 2 decades, strengths have been used in organizations. The early adopters have now adopted. More and more organizations are coming on board with it because of the evidence of the value and the return on investment. But here's some of the reasons why they switch to strengths. They want a more motivating and energizing approach than the usual sort of traditional competence and ordinary performance management approaches that they used to. They say they want an alternative to the soullessness of the competency approach. You know, no one gets really excited when presented with a list of competencies. Often you don't feel really energized or excited when you've been for an interview, but you do with a strengths-based interview. They want to maximize performance. They want people to take ownership of their own development, which is much easier with a strengths approach. They want to deploy their talent more effectively to know who's likely to do really well in certain roles, who's a good fit. These days, increasingly, they want to enhance well-being and resilience, because when you're playing to your strengths, as we've seen, 20% of the time or more, you are more resilient. And they want to increase diversity. So what this approach allows you to do is to see a person for who they are. Simple as that, really. So the difference it makes for organizations that have adopted it, so pre-strength, they're spending a lot more time and money on training, trying to make people into something they're not sometimes. It's, you know, trying to develop the undevelopable. And they don't have any distinction between weaknesses that matter and weaknesses that don't. So, you know, you may have seen this sort of list of competencies where everybody's expected to come up to a certain level, whether or not it's likely to happen for each person or not. And the focus is on legislating behaviour rather than understanding and boosting people's strengths. So it's a completely different mindset. And as we've seen, and as we know from sports teams, the greatest reward for customers, for organisations and for the people themselves comes from understanding and leveraging strengths. So when you're selecting, if you're a person who's responsible for selecting people, or if you're currently looking for a job, the thing about the traditional approach is the question underlying the selection process is, can the person do the job? But with the strengths approach is this person naturally suited to do this job? Do they really want to do it? Because if somebody really wants to do it, they're going to bring a whole lot more energy to it. And even if you're going for interviews in the traditional way, you know, there's nothing to stop you saying to the interviewer, you know, if you were to ask me what I'm really great at, if you were to ask me where my real strengths lie, I would tell you this, that, and the other. And that's really good information for interviewers. And what we find is interviewers love the approach because they get to see people in the round, and they consistently say to us, with the old competency-based approach, when they're thinking about the candidates they've seen, everyone sort of melds into one. It's hard to remember them and as distinct from each other. But with the strengths approach, you really do get to see the real person in front of you. So it's much more helpful, and it gives them more confidence in their hiring decisions. Let me give you an example of a role that you maybe all can relate to: call centre, contact centre agent. So in many contact centres, agents can be recruited with no prior experience. And contrary to what many people think, a lot of people thrive and love the job. And the types of people, we've studied great contact centre agents in a number of organisations. And we've discovered what the great ones have in common, the great ones being people that are really good at the job and thrive in it. They have strengths in common, including they're determined people, they don't give up easily, they have real resilience as a natural strength. A key driver for them is they really love to help and solve problems for people, and they love to have goals to achieve. And then, the knowledge and the skills that are needed for that job can be taught, the product knowledge and the skills, how to use spreadsheets and so on, they can be taught. So big question for you if you're a hiring manager is, what really can you teach? Do you really need people to come with experience? Because if you do, you might be missing out on great candidates. So great employers that have switched on to this mindset, just like great football managers or sports coaches, they appoint for fit. They define the outcome that they want. They motivate and engage people by focusing mostly on their strengths, not ignoring weaknesses, but focusing on mitigating weaknesses that matter. Most of the time, though, it's about strengths, and they really value people's strengths and they stretch them in the direction of their strengths. They're constantly looking to help people develop their strengths. And I talked briefly about return on investment. The strengths approach took off 2 decades ago in the financial services industry because of the return on investment that they started to see. We did some research in the company that I run, Engaging Minds, and these are the sorts of results that we were seeing, and these are not uncommon results. So productivity increased by 20% after 3 months, simply by getting the right people in the roles. Sickness declined, staff engagement up by 15%, candidates saying that they feel the interviewers really get to know them. And it gives the interviewers confidence in their selection decisions because they're seeing the right they're seeing the real person and seeing that they do have the strength for the role. And then in terms of employee turnover, some really big results there for employers that had high staff turnover and some big cost savings as well. So if you're a manager or if you have a manager, the sort of things that you can do is talk to people and bring strengths up to the top of the conversation more. So let's just have our final poll question on this. If you have a manager, how often does your manager speak to you about your strengths? Never, sometimes, or often. Paul, can we go to the poll?
Yep, so the poll's launched, so we're just taking the answers now from the audience. So I'll leave it for a few more moments. Obviously, we will have a Q&A section at the end, so obviously we've got some questions which have been coming in, but obviously if anyone does have a question, please type them in and we'll hopefully get a chance to answer them all at the end. So we're pretty much there with everyone answering the poll. Okay, so we have got 48% say never, 46% say sometimes, and 6% say often.
Can you say that again, Paul? Because I slightly dropped my connection when you was...
Yeah, so we've got 48% say never, 46 say sometimes, and 6% say often.
Wow, that's low for the often, isn't it? So maybe a little bit of advice if you've got a manager that never asks you about your strengths, maybe it's something that you can bring into the conversation. Simply by saying, I was working on this last week and these were the strengths that I use that enabled me to do it well, or to really just to start to plant the seed in your manager about learning about you and what you're really great at. And if you are a manager, well, great managers know these things. They know that people don't change that much and they don't waste their time trying to fix people. They naturally see what's the good in people and try and draw out their strengths and encourage them in that way. And we probably all have come across people like that in our lives. If you're a manager, here's 3 questions that you can ask, and I suggest you ask them every week and check in with people individually, especially in this time of virtual working. It doesn't have to take long and it can make such a difference. Ask people, what are you working on this week? Which of your strengths will you need or are you going to use? How can I help? And that will start to get people aware of their strengths, and it will start to get people to consciously use their strengths as well. One last bit of input I wanted to give you on this webinar, which is to put it in the context of the pandemic really, and how knowing our strengths, knowing others' strengths can support us at home and at work. So if you know your strengths, it's a bit like having a resource in your back pocket that you can bring to bear. You know, if you're having a really bad day, if you're at home with the kids, if you're feeling stressed, everything seems to be going wrong, do something that you know energizes you, even if it's just a couple of minutes, just to switch yourself out of that state that you're in. And it can be such a valuable thing. Also with your kids, you know, if you know that your children particularly love doing a certain thing, you know, you can break the stressful atmosphere by saying, let's just go outside and do this. So it's an incredibly powerful and simple thing you can use as a technique right now. We know it increases well-being, and in terms of job search, sadly, a lot of people are or will be looking for a job. We could do a whole webinar on this subject, but if you're in a sector where it's been really badly hit by the pandemic, and you're thinking about how can I take my experience into another sector, thinking of it in terms of your strengths is really helpful for you in terms of the profile that you put on LinkedIn, the way you express yourself in your CV, and it will also help those who are recruiting to see actually this person has got these kind of characteristics that make for a really great person in this type of role, in this type of company. So rather than just focusing on experience and skills, tell them more about who you are and what you bring. And then for employers, I mean, it's going to be really, really hard to choose people to take them forward into to meet the challenges that have been presented by COVID. So to give them an opportunity to really understand who you are is really great. And as an employer, to really think through what kind of people, you know, who are the types of people that you will really need and rely on right now and as we go into the future. And also, if you're sadly having to make people redundant, it will support them if you can help them to think about themselves in terms of their strengths, or support them to find the right sort of thing for them in the future. And as I've already said, you know, with Black Lives Matter and an increasing awareness of the importance of diversity, it helps you to see people for who they are beyond all the sort of unconscious biases that we might have, and it builds a positive and more human and humane culture because you're honouring people for who they are. Before we move on to the questions, and I think we're doing pretty well for time, Paul, one last takeaway. Good, thanks. One last takeaway for you. When you know your strengths, the great thing about knowing your strengths is you get to live your own life, not somebody else's. So there's, you know, there's real benefit and payback in doing it. Now, the Association of MBAs have kindly made this offer of a 20% discount on the Strengths Workbook. And if you use this discount code, you can get that discount. There are 2 books that I've published. I just want to say a word about the difference between the 2. This is the Strengths book that's shown in the picture. This has got quite a lot of theory, and it's got sections for parents, it's got sections for managers, it's got sections about retirement and careers, and it's got some exercises. The strengths workbook is for people who like to have a lot more exercises to do. It's an 8-week program, although you can do it quicker if you want to. Each week focuses on a theme. 1 week it's strengths, 1 week it's motivations, 1 week it's values. So by the end of the program, you have a really, really detailed picture of your own strengths. So it depends on what you want as to which book is right for you, or they go well together if you fancy both of them. So that's my quick sort of plug and promo, and take a note of that discount code if you're interested. And also, as Paul said, if you've got, we're going to go to questions now. If you have questions that we don't have time to answer on this webinar, we will come back to you in a week or so's time. Is that right, Paul?
Yep, that's fine. Obviously, yeah. After the session, the recording will be downloaded. Just so everyone knows, you'll get a link a week from today with a link to the page. Obviously, that will have the recording on the post-event page, which you'll be able to see the slides and obviously the audio. And obviously, if you wanted to make notes to certain sections which Sally has addressed, you can do so. So yeah, thanks, Sally. Obviously, that was a brilliant webinar. A lot of great takeaways from there. Just before we go into the questions, we did put a question to the audience at the start. Obviously, we wanted to know where everyone was dialing in from today, and obviously just to find out sort of the scope of the audience. So we've had people typing throughout the webinar. So just so you know, we've had people from the UK, Kenya, India, Switzerland, Malaysia, New Zealand, South Africa, China, Belgium, Egypt, Greece, and Turkey, just to name a few. So thanks for everyone joining the webinar today. Obviously, we're going to go into a Q&A section now. If you've got any questions, please type them in. So I'll put forward the first question. It's been it's come in quite a few times, Sally, so it might be easy to put it all into one. So it's around, how can I assess my strengths? Is there any apps, online forms, websites which you would suggest for help?
Yeah, there are quite a few online tests that you can do to assess your strengths. Marcus Buckingham's got a really good, if you Google Marcus Buckingham, he's got a strengths test called Standout, and they're offering it free during the pandemic. So I really recommend that. Obviously, the books that I published, that I've mentioned, there's exercises in there to discover your strengths as well. So there's actually quite a lot of resources online right now. I recommend the reflective approach, which is the approach that I always take, because it really makes you think and go quite deep into your deeper motivations and values, and makes you think about strengths and come up with the words in your own language, so that they resonate with you. So asking yourself questions like, what really gives me a buzz? What do I absolutely look forward to doing? What have I always been drawn to? You can even get out your old school reports if you've still got them, to look at what teachers said about you and what you really were good at and were always keen to do. So they're the sort of questions that you can ask yourself.
Fantastic.
Any other questions, Paul?
Yeah, so we've got questions coming in. So obviously this is a little bit on the back of the first question, which I've just put forward. So it's quite nice to go into this one. So the questions come in and it said, could you please explain how we can discover our true strengths if we feel that we still need to uncover our real strength to use them best?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's definitely a distinction between something that you're good at, that you've learned to be good at, and something that is a strength. The key word here is love. If you don't really love something, get energized by it, it's not a strength. So if you kind of just feel, mildly satisfied by it, it's not your strength. That is your key diagnostic. When you wake up in the morning, do you go, oh, I can't wait to do what I've got to do today? Or do you think, oh my God, I've got to do that thing again that I don't really like? Or do you feel neutral about it? So the love word is the key.
Amazing, excellent. So this has been a very popular question which has come in as well. So it's, what activities do you suggest to encourage people to show their strengths in a team?
Now that's a really good question. I think the sort of things I would do is the sort of questions that I've posed to you just now, is get people to, a couple of things. One is to reflect on those things themselves. maybe write their top 3 strengths on post-it notes, and then to write strengths that you think others have got on post-it notes. So if you think your colleague's really great at X, Y, and Z, so that each person gets a collection of post-it notes. Obviously, we're doing things online now, so maybe you want to do it on chat on Zoom. So each person gets feedback from other people as well as to what they see you're really brilliant at. But yeah, it's a really good activity to do, and I think it is something. I did a session with a leadership team last week actually, where people before the session emailed 3 people asking them when they'd seen them at their best and what strengths did they think they were using, and then brought that information in, shared it with their colleagues, and their colleagues were able to say, oh yes, I think that, or I think I've seen this additional strength as well.
Excellent, fantastic. So we've got a question which has come in around, obviously, when you touch base on the pandemic and obviously people looking for work. So the question is, do you have any tips on how to showcase my strengths and to stand out in virtual interviews?
That's a really good question. And I think the first step has to be really understand for yourself what your strengths are. Because when you're talking about doing those things on interview, it will come across in your energy. And I think we lose something with virtual because we lose that sort of energy that we pick up from people in the room. So don't be afraid to sort of, if you're talking about something that you're really great at, you're passionate about, you love doing, don't be afraid to show it. Don't be afraid to be yourself. And I think the beauty of what's been happening as we've been relating in the real world is people have felt like they can be more themselves. You know, we've gone into each other's homes, things have felt more personal, like me sitting here with, you know, in my small studio room in Greece with my bed behind me. You know, it's all much more acceptable. So we've got more of a license to be ourselves. And I think the other thing is, don't feel like you're showing off. And it's certainly in some cultures, people say to me, but I don't feel as though I can say that because I feel as though I'm bragging. And my answer to that is, if you don't tell them, then you're not doing them the service of allowing them to see how you can help them. So to recap, really figure out what your strengths are. And if the interviewer doesn't ask you questions that mean you can talk about your strengths, you can do something like, you can say this to them, you know, I'm really known at work for being the organised one, or I'm really known for somebody who puts a lot of energy into the detail and making sure that nothing gets missed. That's one technique. Another technique is to say to the interviewer, if they're not asking you about your strengths, is to say, you know, if you were to ask me what my top strengths are, I would tell you, and then list your top strengths. Because if you do that, if you're brave enough to do that, it will really help the interviewer, and it will help them to remember you as well.
Excellent, great.
And of course, don't forget to you know, write those things into your profile on LinkedIn. And I also suggest that when you're putting together a CV, if you've got an opportunity to apply using a CV, you write a short profile at the top of your CV. So the first thing that the recruiter reads is what kind of person you are, because otherwise CVs can be so bland and quite frankly quite boring. Whereas if they read immediately, this is the kind of person, then that's engaging for the people. And write it in your language, not in boring, standard, you know, I'm a self-starter, I'm a team player, which is why I always suggest reflecting on your strengths. So you come up with language that rings true for you, and it's not language that you get from some sort of test.
Excellent. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So we've had a question come in around appraisals, and it's about what's your advice on improving appraisals with staff? Is there better techniques to understand strengths and weaknesses of employees?
Yeah, so remember the 4 boxes that I showed earlier, unrealised strengths, realised strengths, overdone strengths and weaknesses. That's a really good thing to do, to explain to your, if you're a manager and you're going to do an appraisal with staff, is to get them to think about that before you have the conversation. You think about it before you have the conversation, then you can talk around it, and ring fence the weaknesses bit, because people naturally tend to want to fixate on their weaknesses. So say to them, explain to them the best performance comes from understanding and knowing our strengths. So we're going to focus most of the time on that. Those simple things can have a big impact on how helpful the conversation is for both of you. And if you've got an if you're not a manager, but you've got an appraisal system that you're sort of, trapped into, for want of a better word, in your company, it doesn't matter, because you can still talk about your strengths to your manager and sort of train them into thinking that way, and they'll thank you for it, because all managers want to understand more about their people and what motivates them and how to motivate them.
Fantastic. That sort of leads quite nicely into the final question. This has come in quite a lot from the audience. So it's around saying that they feel that their manager doesn't understand or value their strengths, and they feel very demotivated in their current role, and they don't feel energized to at a low level. What's your advice to obviously become more motivated, and what sort of advice do you think you can give to them to improve this situation?
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? I mean, it kind of depends on the manager and whether they're open to a conversation like the one that I was just describing. But even if they're not, what you can do, and I really suggest you do this every Friday, at the end of the day, think to yourself, what did I do this week that I really loved doing and that I did really, really well? It's a moment of reflection. It makes you feel good, because even if you're not getting that feedback from your manager, you're giving it to yourself. And then when it comes to Monday, think to yourself, what am I doing this week? How can I bring my strengths to bear? And if I'm doing some things that really drain me, that aren't playing to my strengths, how can I sandwich those things between things that I find energizing? So it may be, for example, that you're a connector and the virtual world's quite difficult for you. Could you arrange with one or two of your colleagues, or even friends if you haven't got any colleagues, to jump on a call for 5 minutes at the beginning of the day to say, what did I do yesterday that was great? What am I doing today, and how can I use my strengths to do it? Because just that simple act of bringing your strengths to mind makes your heart lift. It makes you feel a bit better. And also get some post-it notes, write your strengths. When you've discovered them, write a strength on a post-it note, stick them around your workstation just to remind yourself of those things.
Fantastic, Sally. Thank you for all your answers. Unfortunately, we are out of time today for this webinar.
That went quick, didn't it?
Yeah, it has gone really quick. So there's been loads and loads of questions coming in. So obviously we'll put them forward to you afterwards, and you'll be able to get in touch with everyone. So obviously, if anyone does have any questions, keep typing them in. We'll download the report and we'll pass it over to Sally. Just so everyone knows, a week from today, there will be a link sent out with to the recording. So obviously that will be able to recap this session. Obviously you can take notes from them and pick up everything which Sally's mentioned. In regards to next webinar, we have one on the 20th of October at 12 to 1 UK time. That's with Giles Watkins, and he'll be discussing how to achieve positive sleep and transform your life. So obviously, if you want to join that session, please head over to the website. Exactly like this one, you just need to fill out the registration form, and then you'll get the link to join. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Sally again for a great webinar, and thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you all on a webinar soon.
Bye everyone, take care. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.